Today, I'd like to talk about grief, faith, and devotion. It doesn't seem at first glance that those things maybe have a lot to do with each other on the surface. During this last week, I had two clients I worked with on Zoom, basically meditation students. Both of them were advanced practitioners. They've meditated for really a long time. And both of them reported that they were happy, that there were no problems in their lives. They were trying to think about what to talk about in our session because there weren't any presenting problems that were bothering their minds. But as we started talking about it a little bit more, they both admitted that even though everything was okay on the surface, there was still a sense of unease. There was still a sense that maybe because their life was pretty stable, there was some equanimity in their lives finally, that because of that, it was uncovering this possibly deeper level of unease, of something that felt out of balance, something felt separated. And when I talked to them about it, it really seemed that what was being experienced was a level of background grief. Now, grief can arise in all kinds of ways. I would like to mention the three main ways that I notice. First of all, there's obviously deep grief. When somebody close to you dies or a close relationship suddenly ends in a way that is not very happy making. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, the other two kinds of grief, a more subtle kind of grief, is really what these two guys were talking about. One kind of grief is all of the grief that we've experienced in the past that was not fully processed. The grief about your childhood, any trauma that you had a long time ago, all these things that were partly processed and partly repressed, shoved down deep into the belly, into the dark deep. And there's another kind of grief that is pretty indistinguishable from that first kind, which is the grief of the day, that we're going through life and we're meeting people and we're looking in the mirror and we're feeling a bit separated from God, from self, from the other person. Not in a big way where relationships are super problematic, but in a more subtle way that there's a sense that we're not really connecting to life. And grief, of course, is the collection of emotions that arise when we're feeling separate. Grief isn't only, I'm sad because somebody died, but grief is anger, grief is frustration, grief is fear, all these emotions that arise when we feel separate. We are all grieving. Deep grief can shatter faith. So the talk today is grief, faith, and devotion. And faith is really crucial to spiritual practice. Whether we have faith in a deity, whether we have faith in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, faith is what really gives us the motivation to practice. It allows us to practice, to trust the surrender that practice really demands. And devotion is the expression of faith. Faith deepens devotion. Devotion enhances faith. There's a very positive cycle there. So without faith, devotion is going to be just on the surface. But just now, right in the moment, I would ask you to feel in your body any sensations of separateness. How connected do you feel to yourself right now? How connected do you feel to me, to what's going on in the room? And instead of transcending these feelings by going to your breath or saying a mantra or something, is it possible to go into the sensations of separateness, to have the faith of going into the grief that is inherent in being human? What we're going to get to today is that, in a way, grief is the gateway to faith and devotion, that working with grief consciously is a key to being able to surrender into practice. Can you have faith right now and not trying to fix the grief? We're not looking at it to make it go away. We're not even trying to understand it. But what does it feel like to be in this messy human incarnation where a lot of the time you're not feeling connected? Trust the grief. Trust the dark as well as the light. Trust, in fact, that the grief is the effect of the delusion of separateness, that we aren't separate, but our conditioning, our relationship with samsara has created this delusion of separateness. And the way back home is having this more intimate, faith-based relationship with grief. Faith that even this grief, these unpleasant sensations, are pure expressions of your true nature. Once again, I'll quote, as I have several times before, this short passage from Rumi's poem, Love Dogs. The longing you express is the return message. The grief you cry out from draws you toward union. Your pure sadness that wants help is the secret cup. So the more we can embrace the naked feeling of grief, just being with the habitual contraction of our human patterns, the more then we can move into devotion. Can we approach this fundamental grief, this contraction, with faith? This approach to grief, in a way, is the secret cup, as Rumi suggests. It's the cup of the elixir of immortality. And then our natural compassion awakens. We can touch and be touched by the grief of others. We can suffer with others, no longer the need to protect. As we meditate on our grief, we learn to inhabit the abandoned terrains of our heart. So that as we have faith to rest in our grief, devotion arises. Sensations become the gateway to presence. People are attached to their grief. People are attached to suffering. We're addicted to getting lost in it, identifying with it, becoming a victim. But emotions help us understand what is happening and give meaning to experience. All emotions, and particularly as we're talking about today, the emotions of grief, are healing messages. They're here to support us. So right now, are you feeling separation? Can you open your heart to the place where you feel separate? Can you have faith to be with that, the rawness of that? What are you willing to receive? What are you willing to be touched by? What are you willing to reach out for? the relationship between grief and faith, that grief tends to create questioning of our beliefs. It can shatter our faith, right? If somebody has deep grief, if somebody you really loved, if somebody's child dies, it's not uncommon for people to say, I can't have faith in a God that would allow my child to die. I can't have faith in a God that allows the war in the Middle East to continue and kill so many children, or the things that happened in October 6th or 7th, whatever that was. On the other hand, grief can strengthen faith. That very often, when people feel a deep grief, it drives them beyond the superficial into a deep questioning of what do they really believe, and it strengthens their sense of faith. Deep grief can create a spiritual crisis, the dark night of the soul, where we feel that God has abandoned us, that we're all alone, that we're living in this world that really has no meaning to it. So that's mostly talking about when we have a deep grief, like a big loss. But that can also be extrapolated, that this daily grief, or the long suppressed, partly processed, partly unprocessed grief, in a moment-to-moment way, has a numbing effect. It separates us from our faith. And can we begin to feel that numbing? Can we begin to feel the price we're paying by not feeling the grief, by not being connected? So faith is belief or trust in either the Dharma or in God or in the deity or in the guru. It's really the foundation of spiritual life. Devotion is an expression of that faith. And faith inspires devotion. Devotion strengthens faith. There's a cyclical relationship. So what we're saying here is that grief can show us where we have faith, where we don't have faith. We can look at our feeling, we can be with our feeling of separation, feel it as sensation, feel it in the body, have the faith to do that. And the more faith we have, that will awaken devotion to the path. So faith without devotion, it is possible to have faith without devotion. It becomes intellectual or passive. There's a lot of people who read a lot of books and they have faith in the books, but it's not really particularly a living kind of faith. Also, it's possible to have devotion without faith. Devotion out of habit, cultural tradition, a sense of duty. If you travel in Asia, there are a lot of people that have devotion to the Buddha. They have a Buddha statue in their home, but it's a family tradition, that it really isn't based on a living faith. It's more of a habit. Okay, so diving in a little more to how we can work with grief consciously. As I said, unresolved grief has a numbing effect, and these effects tend to accumulate and block our free expression of the heart. Our goal is not to stop grief, but to help process it in whatever ways it might arise. There's not one correct way to be with grief, to deal with grief. But I have found that for me, one of the most direct ways for a lot of the people that I work with is to do this conscious grief work, like applying the tantric 3-step, embodied mindfulness, open-hearted compassion, and a tantric understanding to the process of grief itself. Feeling the grief in the body, having compassion for how we've been lost in grief, and realizing that even the grief itself is a pure expression of our true nature. Grief is an armoring against healing. Grief is as old as our self-image, where we first started to believe that we were separate. Grief is our fear of loss, where we feel separate from ourselves. So that where we feel separate from ourselves is the motivation that can drive practice. That can we bring faith to, we can work with even feeling separate from ourselves. Until we're fully able to resolve our grief, compassion and thus devotion will be very limited. If I can't open my heart to how I feel separate from myself, it's going to be very difficult to be with the suffering of another person with an open heart, except very sporadically, and then it will become overwhelming quickly. To be truly compassionate, we have to open to our own grief. Another poem by Rumi. Don't run away from grief, O soul. Look for the remedy inside the pain, because the rose came from the thorn and the ruby came from a stone. And there's a wonderful book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller. He lives here locally in the Bay Area. It's the best book I know about grief. I highly recommend you taking a look at it if you want to more fully dive into your relationship with grief. He says, grief and love are sisters, woven together from the beginning. Their kinship reminds us there is no love that does not contain loss, and no loss that is not a reminder of the love we carry for what we once held close. Grief is our common bond. Opening to our sorrow connects us with everyone. Everywhere it is sacred work. So that faith in practice for many people is learned and deepened in the most challenging times. I mentioned before that my friend Jai Uttal is going to be part of our speaker series in a couple of months from today. And I remember when I had just lost almost all my money with Bernie Madoff. And I was feeling a lot of things, but basically I was grieving that I wasn't the person that I had been a few days ago, which was somebody with enough money to relax about it. Now I was wondering, how am I going to support my child, and am I going to be able to keep my house? And I was in the Fairfax post office saying my mantra, and Jai came into the post office and he said, we really have a lot of faith in God when we're most scared, don't we? And I had to really agree with him. Okay. So grief awakens faith. Faith allows us to work with grief. There's this symbiotic, mutually supporting relationship there between conscious grief and faith. And then the more we have faith, it opens up into devotion. There's a very important relationship between devotion and compassion, because very often when we're doing devotional practices, we tend to judge ourselves for not doing them well enough. We're singing to God, we're saying a mantra, and instead we're thinking about what's for dinner or sex or money or whatever we tend to be preoccupied with. And without compassion, devotion is going to fall apart. We have to really have compassion for the place we don't have devotion. But yet at the same time, the more we go into devotion, which is in a way easier than compassion, it strengthens compassion. In Tibetan Buddhism, they really emphasize working with devotion first, then compassion. But really, they support each other very directly. And then just very briefly, something we've talked about but a long time ago, there are different stages of devotion. So that as we go into grief, it's not going to lead to the same kind of devotion each time. There's invocation level of devotion where we begin to feel our grief. We begin to feel the separation. We begin to feel how we're not connected with ourselves. We're not connected with God. And as we feel that, we feel the sensations in the body. We're feeling the disconnection. And that's in a way the most difficult part. It's again and again touching that which we've developed a personality around not wanting to touch, keeping it at a workable distance. So just again and again, doing that practice that we played with right at the beginning of feeling the grief and having the faith to stay with it, feeling that sense of separation. What are the sensations? And as we do that enough, we begin to see in a very direct way that even this grief is workable. And the heartfelt, the compassion stage of grief begins to arise, where not only are we feeling the separation, but we have this very poignant, sad, yet joyful relationship with the part of us that has been separated. It's not only feeling it, but it's feeling it with open-heartedness, with the sense of deep vulnerability, trusting that we can become vulnerable in relationship to our grief. We begin to trust the innate tenderness of our own heart, our basic goodness, that no matter what the emotion is, that we can be watering the seeds of innate tenderness. And we realize that a broken heart is the quality that allows God to work through us, that it allows the Dharma to work through us. That as long as we're trying to pretend we don't have a broken heart, as long as we're protecting the heart, practice will be pretty superficial. And then finally, there's tantric devotion, where we begin to feel that even the grief, even the messiness of being human, I was just reading an article in the New York Times this morning after I meditated and before the group, I was reading about the war in the Middle East and how there's this opportunity now to bring the war to an end. But of course, both sides are saying they don't want to have any part of that. To hope that this is going to change immediately is probably pretty naive. Hopefully it could happen, probably pretty naive. But can we have compassion? Can we have even this tantric understanding that even what's going on there is some pure expression of the true nature of not only you and me, but collectively of the planet? I work again and again with people who have life-threatening illnesses, mostly people with cancer. And until one is able to admit you're ill, like the first step of the 12 steps, until you're able to say, I need help, healing isn't going to happen. The word patient, being a patient, if you look it up in the source of the word, it means somebody who is able to suffer. Until you're able to and willing to suffer and say, here's what's going on, healing isn't going to happen. So in some ways, Tantra is a lot about our relationship with the sacred feminine, being able to receive experience in a way that we have devotion to the content, to the specifics of what it is that's going on, that war is one face of the mother, cancer is one face of the mother, falling in love is one face of the mother, getting sick is one face of the mother. All of these things are faces of the mother. And the mother, what does she want? She wants to protect her children, to nurture her children, to have them grow up and be strong and productive adults. So that the beloved can only be everything, not just what we want, only everything. And then there's finally non dual devotion, that can we go so deeply into our grief, so deeply into where we feel separate, that we come out the other side and there's no separation at all. It's not that we have a loving relationship with it. It's not that we understand that it's all sacred. It's that there's nobody who's separate, who's experiencing anything. That grief is just one flavor of the oneness. And that there's nobody having to do a practice even. I was with this very sophisticated body worker a couple of weeks ago. I won't mention his name. And he was asking me about what I do with my body. And I said, well, he was asking me if I meditated cross-legged because he wanted to know something about my hips. And he said, if you get old enough, you really don't have to meditate anymore, which I took great comfort from. I don't know if anybody else believes that. Okay. One final little quote here from the Ashtavakra Gita about non-dual devotion. Love your true self with a capital S self. Love your true self, which is naturally happy and peaceful and bright. Awaken to your own nature, and all delusion melts like a dream. In the beginning, I suggested a brief practice that probably fell along by the wayside because of all the wonderful, complicated things that I said. Can we go back to scanning the body for grief, feeling separate? How separate do you feel from me right now? How separate do you feel from yourself? How separate do you feel from God? What does that feel like? What does it feel like in your belly? Can you let your belly be soft as you're breathing? Can you let your belly be full as a way of being able to be with the sensations of separateness? Trusting the pain as well as trusting the light. Feeling that sense of separation. And can you begin to forgive yourself for how you've abandoned yourself? Don't go there so quickly before you've had a chance to feel it, but forgive that part of yourself. Forgive the people that have disappointed you. Gratitude for even this. The sensations of separation, the sensations of forgiveness, grief, compassion for grief. Can we be with those sensations of grief so nakedly that faith begins to deepen, the heart continues to open, we appreciate that whatever emotion that is arising is a healing message. And that fundamentally that there is no one who is doing the practice in the first place. all one consciousness, all one pure awareness. So, John, you wanted to, somebody had a question in the chat or something?
Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat. Craig asked a while back, he says, Dale, can you speak to, and then quotes, collective versus personal, unquote, grief? What is the connection between the two? How does one address them differently and or similarly?
Well, this is a tricky moment here. So I've had some personal conversations with Craig that I'm not really free to divulge. But I think for a lot of us, and for Craig in particular, that before we're worried about collective grief, it's really imperative to do the practice that we were exploring 2 or 3 minutes ago. That until we can begin to feel the collateral damage in our body from not being connected with the messiness of our human incarnation, that we'll be overwhelmed by the collective grief. And when I was reading this article in the New York Times this morning, and it was giving numbers that 3,500 children have died in Gaza, and what happened in Israel. And I mean, you hear those numbers, and in a way, they mean much less than if you looked in the face of one child that was suffering. It's overwhelming. And until we can really surrender into the profound spaciousness of our own hearts, which are in theory and in practice boundless, we won't be able to be with the immensity of suffering that is in the world right now. I mean, there is certainly the possibility that a world war could start any day. Right now, China has surrounded Taiwan with ships. They call it a military exercise, but you never know. Who knows what Israel's going to do to Iran in retaliation, on and on and on. There's so many things and I'm armored against that. I tend to be dispassionate about all the suffering in the world. So if we look at history, there have been people who have gone so deeply into nonviolence and self-compassion, people like Gandhi and Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, that they changed the course of history. But that happened, that their effect on the collective, by expressing the remarkable strength of their own being, the remarkable vulnerability of their own being. Courage is a word that comes from the French root word core, meaning heart. We talked before about the chakras and stages of early childhood development, and that the first thing a child learns is to be grounded, which is the antidote to fear, and then to be centered, which is the antidote to guilt and shame. But when we get to the heart, the demon of the heart, like fear was the antidote, was the demon of the root and guilt and shame of the second and third chakra. The demon of the heart is grief. Grief is the collection of emotions that is the enemy of opening the heart. And the quality, the energetic quality that this little person needs to learn as he is growing up, after learning to be grounded, which is about being physical and being centered, which is about being physical and moving into the world, and then beginning of ego development. The next stage, the heart stage, is about conscious relationship, and the energetic lesson is having appropriate boundaries. So to be able to deal with the collective grief as well as the individual grief means being able to rest in the heart, and that depends on having appropriate boundaries, boundaries that can include and exclude. At times, we have to exclude the suffering that's going on around the world so we can take care of ourselves. At other times, possibly, we can sit down and open our boundary and feel all the suffering that's out there. Now, if you're somebody who was deeply traumatized or sexually abused early in life, maybe opening in this way is not something you're ready to do yet, and you have to work with your own grief about that. That's completely fine. But this quality of opening and closing our boundary as appropriate. If I'm with a client who's dying, I like to include them in my boundary, feel what's going on there. If I'm walking down the street in San Francisco, some of the times maybe I can open my boundary and feel the suffering that's going on around me. Sometimes I can't do that. I have to have a shield around me so I'm not overwhelmed by how much suffering there is out in the world. That's a dance that each of us has to learn to do on our own. If you live in an urban area, we're confronted with collective suffering again and again, all the time. And if we turn on the news, we're confronted with it. So beginning to work with that boundary. There's one Zen writer who said, "Drinking green tea, I stopped the war." And I think what he was saying there is that if you're completely present drinking a cup of green tea, in that moment, there's no violence in the world. So that for each of us, it's our job to, at our own speed, whatever speed that we're able, what we're up for, to become conscious of our wholeness, to do the work so that we can work with the collective grief. Okay, moving on. Great question.
Hi, Dale.
Hi there.
Hi, thank you for the great session as always. I actually wanted to ask you a question about faith and feeling connected, because I feel like personally, as I try to deepen my faith, I've been feeling more kind of disconnected from humanity and from people a little bit.
Yeah.
It's not that I really judge them or anything like that. At least that's not how I feel. But I feel like this urge to kind of get lost, like go maybe in a cave and meditate and kind of disengage from the world. And again, when I try to tune in, I don't feel really angry or depressed or anything like that. But again, I just feel like I don't want to be part of this. And granted, I've lost some connection even with my family members and some of my friends because they feel like I've gone crazy or I'm getting depressed. That's why I'm kind of feeling like I want to isolate myself. But I really don't feel that way. I really actually feel happy. And I'm just like, I just don't want to be part of this, And if you want to kind of keep my company, let's go meditate together or let's just go on this retreat. But so there's this kind of conundrum. I feel more kind of faithful, but less connected to humanity. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Do you feel more connected to yourself or to God?
Yes, I do.
Okay, well, once again, different strokes for different folks. I mean, some people have a monastic streak in them, and the more deeply they plunge into their spiritual practice, there is a life that appeals to them that's a monastic life, or maybe that's a temporary phase. Certainly, there is part of the process of spiritual unfolding where, as people begin to quiet their minds and open their hearts, it reveals a level of agitation and grief and background anxiety. So they feel less connected with everything because they were kind of numbing themselves and not feeling this sense of separation. And when they begin to first feel that, when they begin to feel the disconnection, the anxiety, the fear of death that's always there, it is very disturbing. And they disconnect. They have to pull back. It's very upsetting. And that's a stage that doesn't necessarily go on forever. It goes on for a while. And then they move out of that into being connected. So all I can say is that what you're going through is not atypical. It's not wrong. If we put it in the framework of grief, people grieve very differently. There's no one way to grieve. There's no one successful way to do this. And it may deepen or it may resolve itself. And we don't know. But for you, if you're feeling more connected to yourself, or more connected to self with a capital S, or more connected to God or the Dharma, to me, that's the only important thing.
Okay.
There's this great quote from Julian of Norwich. She said, "I would much rather talk to God than about him." So if you have that direct connection going on, that'll take care of everything else. And if other people aren't on the train with you there, they got off further down the mountain, then that's fine. And I've seen so many relationships end because one of the persons got much more committed to their relationship with truth than the other one. So, I mean, it is one of the sad things about the spiritual path that in some way you are on it completely alone. And in another way, as Natalie suggested, community is of incredible importance.